I guess I could just start by asking you to tell me a bit about what you do. If I'm correct, you're Senior Managing Director and Chairman of Global Advisory at Evercore?
Yes.
Great. So what does that job entail?
So I am an investment banker focused on strategic advice. That means M&A and restructuring.
Right.
And my job at Evercore is 85% dealing with clients and transactions, and the other 15% I still meddle in management of the firm. There's a executive committee of 4 of us that try to make all the important decisions. There's 2 of us that really are devoted these days mostly to clients, and 2 that spend most of their time in managing the firm.
And what do your clients look like? Do you have a special focus?
Some are tall, some are short. Just kidding. I used to focus on telecom, media, but in my advanced stage I've become a generalist. That means that I have no industry in which I focus on predominantly, but the clients range from very large to not so large. So it's really kind of varied, but without an industry focus, which is unusual for bankers these days. There usually are industry verticals that most bankers tend to specialize in, but there's a few of us that get away with being able to kind of surf the world.
And are there challenges associated with being a generalist?
Sure. First and foremost is I don't always have a deep grasp of all the issues affecting a particular industry. And so, but that I try to turn into an advantage, because what I do, what I am able to do is I'm able to have a breadth in terms of industry exposure that allows me to compare and contrast outside of a particular industry. But sometimes it gets pretty technical. And for example, I've spent a lot of time over the past few years in the chemical industry, and I don't always understand what they do, but I've got people with me who do. And at the end of the day, it's not a deep understanding of what the company makes or what the issues are that perhaps clients look to get from a senior banker like myself. They really try to get judgment and advice on oftentimes buying somebody, selling themselves, breaking themselves up, focusing on their balance sheet, what to return to shareholders. So I think generally they're looking for that kind of advice, and I would argue a deep understanding is not necessary, but some understanding, and that's why I usually have an industry person with me.
Got it, got it. Could you tell us a bit about your path to Evercore, how you got from, you don't have to do all the way, but maybe from college to where you are now?
So the path is, I would first say to all of the people watching this video, don't try to plan your path too carefully, because you can't predict the future, and there's a certain serendipity to life that I think everybody needs to understand and embrace. I graduated from college. I won't tell you the year, because I'm trying to hide my age, all right? It's not just, I may regret saying this, but it's men and women hide their age, okay? It's not gender specific. So when I went to college, it was, I'm embarrassed to say that almost half my class went either to medical school or to law school. It was around the time of Vietnam. It was a pretty exciting time, but people generally didn't go into business. It was considered to be bad to do that. So I went to law school, practiced law for 4 years, and I stumbled into investment banking, and that's why I say to people thinking about their career, don't try to plan it too far ahead, because it's a waste of time. Just go with the flow a little bit. And I stumbled into investment banking. I was offered a job. I thought about it and I took it. I realized quickly I had no idea what I was doing. But then I went and I did accept a job at a firm that no longer exists, called Solomon Brothers. I was hired to a large extent because I spoke Spanish. They wanted somebody to cover South America, Latin America really, Mexico and South America. And so Spanish was my hook. Everybody needs a hook. And I became, over time, more of a US-oriented banker. Latin America goes into regular crises every 5 to 10 years, it goes into a crisis, so business dries up, so I had to reorient myself. I stayed at Solomon for a long time, until 2004. I became, over time, head of our M&A department and head of banking, which is basically corporate finance and M&A. And in 2004, I decided it was time to move on, and there was this, I thought about a bunch of alternatives, and there was this smallish firm called Evercore at the time, and I considered various options, and I went to Evercore, started running the advisory practice, which is the main business of the firm, and about 7 years ago I decided I didn't want to run it day to day, so kicked it all upstairs to my boss. But I now, as I said earlier, devote most of my time to clients and transactions. So if you had asked me when I was a junior in college, which I think you can relate to,
Yep.
I would have had no idea
Okay, good.
what my path would have looked like. So to those of you watching this who are not sure what your path looks like, don't worry about it. Nobody does.
Yeah, personally that really reassures me because I think I'm in a similar boat.
Trust me. People have, I find in today's environment, a lot of people get very anxious about planning their career carefully, and I would argue, relax a little bit, because the wind will take you to places that at this stage it's impossible for anybody to predict. That doesn't mean don't have a tiller to steer the boat, but let the wind take you a little bit.
Right. Sometimes it take you to places that you might not even have known existed or considered before.
Yeah. So, and look, I see it in my my 3 children, who are all in their mid-30s to one had just her 40th birthday, and I've seen their career path, and again, they could not have predicted 20 years ago what they would be doing now. They would have had no idea.
Right. Great. Well, you talk about Cuba and how your Spanish language proficiency was kind of the hook that got you into this. Have there been other ways throughout your career, maybe further on in your career, that being from Cuba has influenced maybe how you look at M&A or how you just look at the business world in general?
Great question. Nobody's asked me that question before. That's a great question. It's a creative question. And by the way, people may not realize this, but one of the things that I tell people, I'm coming back to the question. I like to sometimes go in an indirect way.
Take your time.
But that's a creative question, and I think creativity is sometimes underemphasized in today's business environment. Believe me, it's important. I always look for creative people. So the answer I'm tempted to give you is not really whether Cuba influenced in any way my career or entered, not really, because after 4 years of beating my head against the wall in Latin America, and it was tough back in the late 70s, I basically became a US-oriented banker, and being Cuba hasn't really affected my career all that much, either positively or negatively. So I would say those two really haven't intersected. I still call myself Cuban, but in terms of my career, it hasn't really influenced that much what I did or opportunities or challenges. Not really.
Right, that's interesting. And do you get clients who are international?
It's interesting. The answer is for sure. It is. This is going to sound like a cliche, but it really is a global economy, and it really is a global business world. And it's amazing how frequently you run into people that are from far-flung parts of the world. And by the way, we, in my business, still get on a plane at the drop of a hat.
Right.
So I, for example, on Friday, had a meeting in Dusseldorf. So I asked my assistant, how do I get to Dusseldorf? There is a direct flight. By the way, the other thing that's changed is from New York, there are direct flights to just about anywhere in the world.
Right.
So you hop on a plane at 5 in the afternoon, and you land in Dusseldorf, local time 6 in the morning, take a quick shower, go to the meeting, come back.
Perfect.
So we do that all the time. But that's not just global travel. I think your question goes a little bit to the people you meet. So last week, just by way of illustration, I went to another meeting up in the Boston area where there were two people from the company that we were visiting, one on the phone, and one of the two that were present at the meeting, he had a bit of an accent, and I generally am very intrusive, and I asked people, where are you from? I asked him, where is he from? He's from Cyprus.
Wow.
There you go. So, and he was the CFO of a pretty large company.
Right.
You run into that all the time. People who with enormously international backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
So to the extent you're studying international relations, at least that will give you, hopefully, a window into kind of what the world is all about, and being able to relate to people who were not raised in Connecticut
Mm-hmm.
is important, because it really is a
Definitely.
very global environment.
Right, and I think that's one of the kind of overall goals of this conference, the international conference, is to bring in attendees. You'll meet some. Are you doing a seminar later?
Yes,
Yeah.
and by the way, it's also, if you look at the background, I looked at the background briefly as we were waiting here, of the people who are going to attend the seminar, and half of them are from faraway places.
Exactly.
If you look at the incoming analyst and associate class at Evercore, extraordinarily international
Really?
background. And then one of the things I do is I do enjoy career counseling, if we can call it that.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I'm a so-called executive in residence at Columbia Business School, and I go up there 3 or 4 times a year. I also lecture in some classes, but I go up there to give students who are first year mostly. Some are already second year, but I don't know, 60%, 70% are first year, who've gone to business school to pivot in their careers. So a lot of people, when they're 27, 28, they'll go to business school because they want to do something different. At least 50% are not from the U.S.
Wow.
It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
So it is much more. Again, this is like a cliche. It's much more of a global environment that I think generally even people perceive.
And do you think that there is something that undergraduates or attendees should be doing at this stage in their college life to prepare for that kind of new emerging market?
Oh, that's another great question. It's a completely good and appropriate question, as I said. I'm tempted to give you a little bit of a hedged answer. What do I mean by that? I mean, do something if it interests you. It's something if you feel a particular draw to that subject or that activity. I'm tempted to say, don't do it just because you think you have to have it on your CV.
Right.
Because CVs come in all kinds of flavors and colors, and I look for originality, I look for commitment, I look for something that's interesting, no matter what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's an international piece of it, that's a component, but I don't necessarily got to look for that and check that box. So I would say, on the one hand, do something international if you're drawn to it, but not because you want to build a CV. But if you're drawn to it, I think it is a good thing to have some international exposure. Did you go to junior year abroad?
I didn't, but I took a gap year before college.
Oh, you did?
And I've spent the past 2 summers abroad as well.
Where did you go on your gap year?
I was in Thailand.
Cool.
Pattaya, Thailand.
What were you doing there?
I was teaching at an international school.
Oh, so you did your international thing. That's awesome.
Yeah. I thought it would be a great time. I loved my gap year, and I thought it was a great time to do it before kind of the whole job thing got heated and everyone was stressed.
So my 3 children, maybe not the oldest. My oldest is the most disciplined and dedicated of the 3 kids. They're all great, but she is just very, very tough-minded, and she didn't need a gap year. I argue, if my children are watching this, I think hopefully they won't be surprised, but I think they both would have benefited from a gap year, just because they kind of frittered their first 2 years in college. And did a lot of partying, and then they finally got their act together. Those two went to Duke, and they did fine, and but they frittered a little bit, I think, the first couple of years. But they went, and all three did junior year abroad.
Oh, wow.
So I do encourage an international stint if you're mildly attracted. If you are abhorrent at the thought, if it's abhorrent to you, don't do it just because you think you have to do it. But if it's attractive to you, definitely. And the fact that you spent a gap year in Thailand, I'm sure you look back and probably that was one of the most interesting and educational years of your so far academic life, mostly. My youngest son, who really frittered his Edward, don't get mad at me. He didn't really, I think, focus his 4 years at Duke, and then he went after Duke. He went to China to teach for a year.
Right, there was his gap year.
And his gap year was at the other end of his college education, but that's where he basically matured and grew up.
Yeah.
And by the way, he wrote a hysterical book about his year in China. So those of you who are curious, go to Amazon. It's called China, Man. He's got the same name as me. It is a hysterical year. And if some of the audience here wants to kind of get a glimpse into what one does when one goes abroad for a year, I think it's very funny. And he got there without knowing what he was going to do, and he came back really focused and much more mature. But so he benefited greatly from junior year, for perhaps different reasons than most people want to get the experience of different cultures. But sometimes when you go to a faraway place, it's a way to find yourself, and because there are challenges that don't exist if you just go around the corner. But when you are some strange place, I think you really have to dig deep and kind of draw upon your own qualities to be able to thrive in an unfamiliar environment.
Right, right. Yeah, and for me also, it was just to be able to see that the world of business is bigger than just Wall Street, bigger than just this little tiny corner that we're all so familiar with. I would meet like incredible business people over in Bangkok this past summer and realize that there are all these doors that are open that I think some of us just don't know about. So that was great.
Yeah, and there's, by the way, even as you progress in your professional life, being able to have other things besides your professional life, I've always, well, not always, but in the last 25 years, I've been involved with at least one or two not-for-profits, and the one that I spend the most time at these days is something called the International Rescue Committee. We help refugees all over the world. And last October, I went to Iraq, of all places, and place very much in the news because I went to Erbil, which is the main city of the Kurdish area, and we all know what's happening in that part of the world. But to this day, having that international global perspective, I think it's just part of life.
Right, definitely. And how do you balance the time you spend with philanthropy with the time with your company? And do you have a viewpoint on corporate philanthropy? It's
something that when I decided to make room for at least one or two not-for-profits, I just did it. Mm-hmm. And you'd be surprised, if you commit to something, you'll find the time. Now, will it get in the way occasionally? Sure. Will you miss one of their board meetings or other scheduled events of the not-for-profit because you had a business conflict? Sure. Vice versa. Will you sometimes skip a business commitment because you had a not-for-profit commitment? Sure. But if you commit to it, you'll find the time.
Right.
So I don't buy the fact that you're too busy to make additional commitments. And the old saying, if you want to get something done, go look for the busiest person. And I think there's a lot of truth to that because you can always just balance it. I think in terms of corporate philanthropy, that's a complicated question because, and by the way, the pendulum, swings. Mm-hmm. And back in the, I think, 80s and 90s, and most recently, it was all about companies were driven to create shareholder value, and that was it.
Right.
And in fact, in many transactions, the law says you're supposed to put first and foremost in Delaware, which is where many companies are incorporated. That's what the law says when you're selling a company.
Right.
It's about shareholder value. But the pendulum is swinging for all the reasons I think we'll read about. And so in a world where companies are supposed to do more than just maximize shareholder value, but they have other constituencies they're supposed to address and take care of and balance, you could make the case that corporate philanthropy is perhaps part of that, but you got to be careful because a lot of people will say, look, philanthropy is really not the mission of a company, and it can't be completely disassociated with the company's basic objectives and business purposes. I think at the end of the day, there probably is room for corporate philanthropy, but you've got to be careful about how you explain why you're taking X amount of dollars and putting it to work in something that has to have, I think, some measure of connection to the activity of the company. And by the way, some companies, I think, do create vehicles for certainly employees to contribute, and some companies do have matching funds for people who make contributions. But I think it's a nuanced question. Excuse me, it's a clear question. The answer, I think, has to be a little bit nuanced, and you could tell from my answer, I'm not sure I have a strong view.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I think in a measured, balanced way, there probably is room, but you got to be careful because it's easy to wander, and it's easy to open the door for some criticism if you're not connecting it somehow to the company's primary business objectives.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough call to make, especially when there's shareholders involved. You could say you have a responsibility to them first and foremost.
Well, again, somebody who might say that's no room for corporate philanthropy might make the argument, which I think has some truth to it, is, okay, give the money back to shareholders, let them decide what philanthropic activities they want to support, let them decide. Again, I think it's never that black and white. For example, in my International Rescue Committee activities, the co-chair is a woman who actually is the daughter of somebody that used to be my partner, but she works at Pfizer, and Pfizer has definitely a philanthropic arm that is connected, I believe, to delivery of health objectives and health care that is supportive of the IRC. And there, I think they really have a very good connection to what their main business purpose is. So there's an example of somebody, I think, that has found a balance.
To backtrack a bit, I remember you saying that you had given up some of your management duties of Evercore to your boss, did you say? And then instead you took more focus with working directly with M&As and clients. Was there a reason for that transition?
Yeah, in terms of having responsibilities for managing a business, been there, done that. Been there, done that.
Boring.
No, boring is, you do in your business life, you do have to evolve. And I had a job at my prior employer, which was Solomon Brothers. They got sold to Travelers and merged with Citi, create the Citi Group. I used to run, again, the investment bank. And back in 2001, I had been thinking about it, and I went to my boss and I said, look, I don't want to do this anymore. Here are my two successors. I'll take the title of chairman. I've done this before. Take the title of chairman, and I'm taking the summer off. He was so taken aback. He kind of went, okay. So I had a great summer. But the point being that I had done that. I had done the management thing. When I came to Evercore, I wasn't thinking of also taking on management responsibilities, but the founder of the firm, in trying to lure me to Evercore, said, you come here and you run it. You've done this before, you run it. So I did for a bunch of years. Then I did something that, in hindsight, was probably a mistake, in terms of what it cost my firm, which is I went on the board of a large public company, and that created all kinds of conflicts. And so in order to reduce those conflicts, that was a good moment in time to switch to say to the guy who runs the company today, all this stuff I do, you do it.
Right.
And to this day, that has survived, but I've been there, done that. I had no interest in continuing to have people come into my office and complain about this, that, and the other. And I, at this stage, find just dealing with clients' issues and providing advice, I just find it's much more interesting to me at this point in my career. But those of you who want to go up the corporate ladder, go for it. Go for it. I did. And there's nothing wrong with being ambitious, nothing wrong with wanting to have more and more responsibility, nothing wrong with wanting to be CEO of a company. And so go for it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure that all of our attendees will be very happy to hear you say that.
Well, they all want to. They don't all want to go work for companies. They all want to start their own company.
Yeah,
that's what everyone wants to do.
Right.
Which is, it's hard work.
It is.
It's hard work. I have a son-in-law that tried that for a while. It didn't work out. My son actually has a startup that is doing extraordinarily well.
Wow.
But his hair is on fire 24/7. So be careful. Make sure you want what you wish for, because you might get it. But anyway, there's nothing wrong with trying to start your own company. It's like everything in life. It's got positives and negatives.
Yeah,
but I will tell you, you got to have your hair on fire to do that.
Definitely.
What are you going to do when you graduate? Do you have any idea?
That's a good question. I'm hoping to take some time to work. I'm not quite sure in what industry yet. I was thinking maybe management consulting, and then I'm hoping to go to law school and someday be on the Supreme Court. I'm kidding. That's my mom's goals for me. She wrote it on a little sticky note.
Did you see the movie On the Basis of Sex?
I haven't.
Which is the story, you saw it, right?
The RBG movie.
Yeah, well, no, there's two movies. The RBG documentary, and then there's a Hollywood fictionalized, but based, I think, in true life, of her life. It's the story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg from the time she went to law school to the time I think she argued a case in front of the Supreme Court, which was the case that was the seminal case to address the issue of gender discrimination in a lot of federal programs and federal laws, and she had a very creative way to win her case. So there you go.
I'll definitely watch that.
Maybe she's your role model.
She is. It's just the tough part, because no one can beat her.
Well, no, yeah. There's always, again, every generation produces its own special people.
Definitely.
But look, my son, senior year. You're not even senior year yet. In his book, one of the things that's very funny, how mom and dad would badger him. What are you going to do in February of his senior year? I don't know. March, what are you going to do? I don't know. April, stop bothering me. I don't know. May, graduates, what are you going to do? I'm not sure. Oh my goodness. Go to China. Okay, that's a good idea. I went to China.
That is, I think that was a good call for him.
There you go.
I'm excited to read his book also. It sounds so...
Yeah, China, Common Man. Everybody, go buy it.
Great. Well, I don't have anything else for you. Do you have any just extra tidbits of advice that you think students might want to glean some guidance from?
No, perhaps the only comment, and I say this in a supportive way, that because I do observe in meeting with lots of students, including Upper Columbia and so on and so forth, people do these days, there's a careerism in people's sort of development of their own activity or selection of their own non-academic activities, which maybe you can't avoid it, but for example, when people ask me, what did you do between junior and senior years in college, where many of you are trying to build up your CV? Well, I went and worked at a ranch in Australia.
Really?
Wow. I thought I was going to be driving cattle, but they realized I had no skills, so I was just basically shoveling mud for 2 months. But there's a certain element of careerism which maybe is inevitable, but the well-rounded person is still, I think, important. Doing things like what you did in going to Thailand for a year during your gap year, I think is still a great way to develop your own self. And a quote that I am now using or borrowing is, I think it was the CEO of American Airlines the other day gave an interview. I think it was to the Journal of the Times. And I love his last, it was the last quote that was in the interview, which was, the minute I stopped trying to manage my career took off. There is something to that. Just focus on the immediate, do it well, and the rest will more likely than not take care of itself. That's my parting pearls of wisdom.
That's great advice.
Anyway, hope the conference goes well.
Thank you for being here.
And my pleasure, and good luck to you.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, okay, thanks.